Good morning. Today we will be reading in Ephesians chapter 5 and chapter 6. Wherefore he saith, Awake thou that sleepest, and arise from the dead, and Christ shall give thee light. See then that ye walk circumspectly, not as fools but as wise, redeeming the time, because the days are evil. Wherefore be ye not unwise, but understanding that what the will of the Lord is. And be not drunk with wine, wherein is excess, but be filled with the Spirit, speaking to yourselves in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody in your heart to the Lord, giving thanks always for all things unto God and the Father in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, submitting yourselves one to another in the fear of God. Servants, be obedient to them that are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in singleness of your heart as unto Christ, not with eye service as men pleasers, but as the servants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, with good will doing service as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatsoever good thing any man doeth, the same shall he receive of the Lord, whether he'll be bond or free. And ye masters do the same things unto them, forbearing, threatening, knowing that your master also is in heaven, neither is there respect of persons with him. This is the word of the Lord.
All right. Thank you very much. So we are looking at this portion that deals with masters and slaves. And as Mike pointed out, it would be disingenuous of us to simply skip over and say, well, he wasn't really talking about slavery. Or since there's no longer slavery here in America, then let's just talk about employment. And there's no doubt that if we're looking for guidance on employment and how to be a good boss or a good manager or a good employer or a good employee, well, this would certainly be one of the principal places where we would go, because there's a lot of principles that cross over. And you can read this and you can garner from those principles how you should conduct your business, how you should conduct yourself as a worker, as an employee. There's a lot of principles, and we'll get to those. But it's disingenuous to pretend that Paul wasn't speaking of slavery, because it's unpalatable, because it's not something any of us really want to think about or consider. And there's a lot of people that would just want to say, well, he's not really talking about slavery. Yes, he is. He certainly is. That's just it doesn't anyone any good to do that. Now, the reason why we think it's important to deal with this is because if you're going to deal with people who are skeptical or antagonistic to Christianity, well, they're going to bring out three principal arguments or objections to Christianity. They're going to talk about the genocide that they see committed in the Old Testament, where God commanded the Jews to go out and raze entire villages and entire cities. So you're going to have that. They're going to talk about the treatment of women in the Bible, which we've dealt with, and they're going to talk about slavery. They'll probably have some others, but these are the three big ones you're going to find from anyone who's really antagonistic to the scriptures and they have an objection to it or an argument against it. And just closing our eyes and pretending that none of that existed, or somehow the apostles were abolitionists and trying to paint that into their, or write that into their writings, or insert it into their writings, that's not helping anything. So we need to be, I think we need to be honest. Now, those that object to the New Testament on grounds of slavery, they're judging a time they don't usually understand much about, based on a very contemporary privilege that they have today. It's what C.S. Lewis famously called chronological snobbery. It's where we look back in time and think, well, I wouldn't have done what they did. Now, this is rampant in all ages. All of us look back and think, well, those people sure were ignorant. If I would have lived there, I wouldn't have been ignorant like that. If I would have lived then, I would have been an abolitionist. Jordan Peterson, many of you know who he is, very well-known and popular social commentator and psychologist. He makes a really good point on this type of thinking, and that is that he often would tell his students in his lectures in Canada, he would tell them, if you had lived in German, if you'd been German and living in Germany in the 1930s, you were far more likely to be a Nazi, right, than to be a Bonhoeffer. Now, you may not know who Bonhoeffer is. He was a German pastor who went back to Germany after Hitler. He was in the U.S. when Hitler came to power. He went back to Germany, and he led the Christian resistance against Nazism, and eventually it cost him his life. Now, if you and I had been in Germany in that time, I know we would like to think we'd be Bonhoeffer, but odds are, and you'd be far safer to assume that you would have been like all those thousands upon thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people like in Vienna who applauded and sung and celebrated Adolf Hitler when he rode into Vienna. John Longo wrote a really interesting book called Hitler and the Habsburgs, where it deals with the descendants of the Archduke Ferdinand, who was killed, that primed the First World War, that led to the Second World War, and he shows the connections between Hitler and that family. But one of the things that he documents is that the kids of the Archduke, long after Second World War was over, and they had made it through, many of them, they would talk about all the phantoms that lived in Vienna, because they said when Hitler had come to power in the 30s, all of Vienna, which was in Austria, and was gobbled up by Hitler's, one of the first things he did was take over Austria. All the people of Vienna were on the streets celebrating Hitler. Tens of thousands. But as soon as the war turned in the mid-40s, or the early 40s, and Hitler was no longer seen to be possible to win, pretty much everyone but Hitler knew he was going to lose, all of a sudden, nobody even knew that it had happened. They hadn't been there. They were out of town when that happened. And they would often laugh about all the phantoms that obviously were celebrating Hitler, because there wasn't anyone in Vienna anymore. And that's the type of thinking that we often find when it relates to this. If you had lived in the South, in the antebellum South, you most likely would have been a slaveholder or been in agreement with it. And if you don't think that you are capable of that, then you're not very self-aware. Okay, so we want to be careful when we look back and be too judgmental about what they did and didn't do. That isn't to say that anything that was done is okay. That's not what we're saying. We're just saying that we need to be careful with being so judgmental. Now, as we look at this and we think, well, why didn't Paul just flat out condemn slavery? And you have to understand, the apostles, they weren't very concerned with freedom. Now, that may not sound good to you. That may sound weird, but they really weren't. They were moving in the opposite direction. This is one of the fascinating things about the New Testament. They weren't moving towards freedom. The apostles saw Christianity as moving towards slavery. Now, not exactly the type of slavery you and I might have in mind, but they were moving towards submission. Away from freedom. They wanted to become servants. Now, you and I today, that sounds a lot more reasonable than it did back then. Today, the idea, if I say we should be moving towards being servants, most people, including non-Christians, will go, oh yeah, that's right, that's good. But in the time of Paul, that's not how it was looked at. That was saying, you understand, we don't live in a class-based society. And that's great. This is not a criticism. That's wonderful. But if you've ever been around a society that is class-based, or at least done some research into it, you'd understand that the notion of saying we want to demote ourselves, that is not reasonable. That would be considered really unreasonable. You don't look to demote yourself down the classes. Well, that's what the apostles were promoting. They're promoting submission. We just read it. Kristen just read the text, right? It says, submit yourselves one to another. Submission is the promotion. Servanthood. What they're promoting is to leave freedom and become the bondsman of Christ. Paul says in one place in Corinthians, he says that those that are free, speaking like politically or like physical slavery, those that are free, he says, you should rejoice in that now you're a bondsman in Christ. You're now a slave of Christ. That's what they were promoting. That's what they were putting out there. And so no, they're not too concerned about any form of freedom. Another reason is because they don't really see that there really is any real form of freedom. Now this is a lot more philosophical than the previous point, but it's well borne out throughout the scriptures, throughout the New Testament. Mike touched on it in Romans, and Jesus also taught it. Both Paul and Jesus taught it very clearly. The idea that you can actually be free is a myth. You can't be free. You will serve someone. Back in 1979, there was a bit of a argument in the pop music world. Bob Dylan had famously converted to evangelical Christianity, and he had written a whole album, his Christian album. He'd written an album, and he had a very famous song. In fact, it was a Grammy awarded song, and it's still pretty popular. And the song was called "You Gotta Serve Somebody." It goes. The whole song talks like this, but I'll give you a sample if you haven't heard it. For instance, says, "You may be an ambassador to England or France. You may like to gamble, you might like to dance. You may be the heavyweight champion of the world. You may be a socialite with a long string of pearls, but you're going to have to serve somebody." Yes, indeed, you're going to have to serve somebody. Well, it may be the devil or it may be the Lord, but you're going to have to serve somebody. And he wrote that song. John Lennon, who was a committed Marxist, an atheist, shortly after that, he released his response to Bob Dylan, and his song was "Serve Yourself." So he says, you got to serve yourself. Ain't no one going to do it for you. You got to serve yourself. Ain't no one going to do it for you. Well, you may believe in devils. You may believe in lords. But if you don't go out and serve yourself, lad, ain't no room service here. So his view is, you don't have to serve anybody. You can be free from all servitude, and you can just serve yourself. Dylan got that right, and Lennon got it wrong on many levels. Jesus said, you become the slave of whatever you obey. So whatever thing you obey, whatever thing you lend yourself to, that's your master. Why can't you just serve yourself? Well, it's the same reason that you can't forgive yourself. It's the same reason that you can't give a gift to yourself. I know we talk like that, like, oh, I've had such a hard week. I'm going to go give myself something. You can't actually give yourself anything. You're the one buying it. If you're the one paying for it, it's not a gift. You cannot gift to yourself. You cannot forgive yourself. You cannot love yourself, just like you can't lift yourself into the air. You can't do these things for yourself. You cannot love yourself. That's not what love is. I know we use these terms and we use them loosely, that's whatever, but if you look at it very technically, these things aren't possible, and you cannot serve yourself because you're the one being benefited. Serving is when another is benefited. You will serve something, and you will serve someone. Your only real choice, and this is why the apostles weren't too concerned with freedom, is that ultimately they didn't see it as possible. They saw it as an illusion. You have the illusion of freedom. I'm free. I can do anything I want. No, you can't. You cannot do anything you want. In fact, you can't do hardly anything you want to do. You're restricted on all sides. And there's no utopia out there where people are actually free. The freest people in the world are in bondage to their own vices. They're in bondage to their own foibles. They're in bondage to their own weaknesses, to their own necessities. They have to eat. They have to drink. They have to breathe. You're restricted. The real question is, who do you choose to be in bondage to? Well, Jesus and the apostles, especially Paul, their admonition was, you should become the servant of Christ. You are not ever going to be free, but you could be servant to Christ. And that's what Jesus said, right? He stands up and says, take my yoke. Become, well, worse than a slave, really, if you think about it. A yoke, I don't know if you know what a yoke is. If you were raised on a farm, you probably know what a yoke is. But a yoke is an implement that's used to harness horse, or specifically oxen, to a plow. He's basically saying, become my ox. I mean, in metaphor. But he's using a metaphor that's even lower than slavery. This is why you need Jesus, because he's offering a slavery that is better than your ideal of freedom. He says, take my yoke upon you. My yoke is easy. My burden is light. Your burden of freedom is heavier than Jesus' burden of slavery. So when the apostles looked at this, it wasn't that they're okay with Roman slavery or antebellum South slavery or the North Atlantic trade slavery. They're not okay with these things. And there's a lot of principles in scriptures that were used during the Southern argument, the North-South arguments over slavery. There's a great book on this if you want to look at it called The Civil War as a Theological Crisis by Mark Knoll. And he goes through and discusses a lot of the arguments between the North and the South over slavery, the biblical theological arguments over it. So it's not that they're okay with that type of slavery, but they're looking at it in the big picture saying, you could achieve your freedom from your slave master, and you are just as much, perhaps even greater enslaved to your own weaknesses, your own vices, your own sins. You're enslaved to darkness, to demons. That's what Paul looked at when he looked out at the free state of Athens, that they were enslaved to their superstition. So they just didn't look at freedom as being this tremendous thing to pursue. That's why Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 9:19, he says, though I be free from all men, yet I have made myself servant unto all. This is language that is all throughout the New Testament. You don't ever find them parading about freedom. Oh, freedom, it's so wonderful. We all need to be free. Rise up and be free. You don't find that hardly at all, but you do find over and over and over again that they proclaim themselves to be slaves. Slaves to Christ, slaves to righteousness, slaves to everyone, slaves to their fellow man. We are servants of all. Paul ridicules the Corinthians because he says, you reign, we die. You reign. You think you're kings. I wish you were kings. But what about the apostles? We die daily. Most of Paul's letters Ephesians is actually one of the few exceptions. But most of Paul's letters begin by him saying, Paul, a servant, a slave of Jesus Christ. That's how he identified. That's why Christianity was despised from the first century all the way through till today. Nietzsche was famous. Friedrich Nietzsche, German philosopher in the early 1900s, famous for decrying Christianity as a slave religion, a slave mentality religion. You could look at it, and many people now look at the New Testament and say, oh, it's so oppressive to women. It's so oppressive to slaves. It's so horrible. But you have to realize that Christianity was despised in its day and despised throughout history because it was a religion that appealed to women, to slaves, and to the weak. If it was so horrible, why were women flocking to Christianity? Rodney Stark, I've mentioned him before, a number of his books. He documents the rise of Christianity and the demographics of it. And he points out that overwhelmingly Christianity was composed of women, children, and slaves. Free men, citizen men, were a minority in Christianity. Now, if Christianity was so horrible to slaves, why would slaves want to be Christians? Obviously, we're not understanding what Paul was doing here in Ephesians. What Paul was doing is he was saying we're not going to have violent revolt. We're not going to do that. He's saying we're going to have a much broader and a much broader perspective and a much longer term view about what all of these things are and how we're going to go about handling them. One of the best examples of Paul's handling of slavery itself is the book of Philemon, where Paul has taken a slave, a runaway slave by the name of Onesimus. He has taken him in, he has helped him out, and now he's sending him back to his master. Philemon was Onesimus' master, who happened to be a close friend of Paul. And instead of saying, hey, keep running or be free, he says, you need to go back. And he sends him back, and he sends him back with the letter of Philemon, a little one-chapter letter. And basically what he tells Philemon is, you need to receive him. You need to forgive him anything he might have done wrong or he might owe you. You need to forgive him, and you need to receive him again, not as a servant, but as an eternal brother. If you want to know how Paul thought we could overcome such evils as slavery is, and it is, and if I have left any room for doubt, let me just be super clear. Physical slavery is an unmitigated evil. There's no excuse for it. But Paul saw that there was a better, more lasting, more transformative and transcendent solution to slavery than violent revolt. There were, as Mike pointed out last week, there were countless slave rebellions through the 1500 years of Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was around for a very long time, and there were many, many slave uprisings. It was one of the greatest fears of the Roman Empire were slave uprisings. And none of them really accomplished anything lasting. But Christianity is the only thing that has ever ended slavery. And it didn't do it through violence. We often look at the Civil War, for instance, in America, and there was a tremendous amount of violence done, fighting over that issue, litigating it through weapons and through bloodshed. What is often overlooked is that before, quite a bit before even Abraham Lincoln was elected, the Quakers, who are a fringe Christian group, they also held slaves. Now, they were pretty much against the slave trade, but they weren't against slave holding. Now, how they reconciled that, I don't know, right? That's kind of like, that's kind of odd. But anyways, they held slaves. Well, there was a Quaker man who was very committed abolitionist, and what he did is he traveled. He gave up his business. He sold his business, and he just dedicated himself to traveling from farm to farm all down the east seaboard to all the Quakers that he knew and could find. And with patience and love and without condemnation, they said, would reason with them on the evils of slavery. That by the time Abraham Lincoln had been elected, Quakers, almost not a single one of them owned slaves anymore. They had all voluntarily and peacefully freed their slaves and renounced it. Now, you might think that, without violence and war and force of law and force of military, well, then that would just lead to tremendous abuse. But this is why Paul doesn't just write to slaves. In our text, he writes to slaves and he gives them a series of admonitions that Mike talked about last week. That they should be obedient, and that they should be concerned with the welfare of their masters, and that they should be good slaves. Now that may sound like horrible advice, but it's actually very good advice. But then he tells the master something. Now I want you to pay attention. There's a lot here we won't get to today, so we're only going to really look at two things today. The first one is this. Look at what he tells masters in verse 9. This is so often overlooked. He says, "And ye masters, do the same things unto them." Isn't that odd? So he's given all this advice to slaves. He's told them, be obedient and fear and trembling and singleness of heart, not be men pleasers, but do it like service to God. And then he says, and masters, same thing goes for you. Well, that seems kind of odd, because it's like, well, how does a master do those things? But see, he's tying back to what we talked about earlier. What is the summary of all of these things? The relationship of husbands and wives, of children and parents, of masters and slaves. What's the relationship that Paul is promoting as the Christian relationship? Submissive one to another. Is he meaning that slaves and masters are submitting to each other? Well, that's what he just got done saying again. What I just said to slaves, masters, you do that too. That applies to you also. The Australian theologian Peter O'Brien. He wrote a really good commentary on Ephesians. It's very hard to find because they took it out of print for a number of reasons, so you got to look around if you want it and try to find it, and they're not cheap anymore. But he points out in his commentary that what Paul describes in these relationships of marriage and children and slavery is a reciprocal and mutual submission, but not a symmetrical one. Right? That's his insight. It's mutual, it's reciprocal, but it's not symmetrical. What does that mean? Well, it means that each person in a relationship has a different role. So Paul is not advocating the modern utopian concept that what we need to do is just eradicate all the different roles and just flatten society down so everybody's the same. Men and women are the same. Adults and children are the same. Bosses and employees, everyone's the same. Get rid of all differences, right? Flatten it. That's not what Paul's saying. Paul's saying, no, let's embrace these differences. In marriage, there is a man and there's a woman, and they both have different roles. So there isn't going to be symmetry, but there will be reciprocity. Now that requires nuance and sophistication. The way the world wants to handle marriage, which is essentially flatten and say everything gets split down the middle and each side must do what the other side does and there can't be any differences. That's childlike thinking. That's foolish thinking. Christianity says, no, there are differences. These differences are made by God, and they're beautiful and they're wonderful. But these differences should not turn into tyranny. And that's going to require a great deal of thought and love to work that out. So this is what he says of slaves and masters. This is a relationship that could very easily, and we're all painfully familiar with this, but it could very easily become tyrannical. In fact, it almost always does. This is a huge problem with slavery, is that it becomes tyrannical. The powerful, the master, becomes tyrannical over the weak slave. Paul is saying no. In fact, he says, you will not use threats and force. Now you might ask, why didn't Paul just say, okay, masters, free your slaves and go do your own work? Well, there's a lot of reasons for that, and there are a lot more than what we can get into today. But I would point out, let's try to just look at it from one perspective, just for sake of time, and look at it just as it could apply to ourselves today. The solution to if you work somewhere and your boss is a tyrant, the solution to that is not, let's just get rid of management. Because that doesn't work. There's a reason why some people are in charge at work and other people aren't. There's a number of reasons. One reason why is because some people have a talent for management and other people don't. This isn't just a matter of like they threw dice and it landed on them so they get to be in charge. That's not how it works generally. And when they do something like that, it doesn't work very well at all. You got to find people who are truly gifted in leadership, and they need to lead. Now, can that person get to thinking, well, I'm in charge, so that means I get to tell everyone what to do, and I get to be tyrannical? Sure, it can lead to that. And then we have a total breakdown of productivity. So how does this supposed to work? There's a young man, I think he was in like the 60s. His name was Robert Greenleaf. And in college, he said he had one of his professors told them that there was a real problem in corporate America, and that the country was in desperate need of people, young people, to really get in and fix this problem of the authoritarianness that was destroying American businesses. Now, the professor says there's two ways you can go about this. You can either try to change things from the outside like I'm doing, or you can actually get yourself into the inside and try to make changes from the inside out. So Greenleaf decided to do that. He went and, even though he had a college degree, he went and got a job at AT&T, which at that time was the largest company in the world. And he started out digging, post hole digger, putting in the telephone poles, and worked his way up into the upper echelons of the AT&T leadership as an executive, and did tremendous changes in AT&T through that, because he became their professor or their teacher of their corporate way of doing business. And when, after a long career at AT&T, he retired, and he wrote probably the most, or at least one of the most influential books in American capitalism, or in capitalism in general. And that book was called Servant Leadership. He coined that term, and he wrote this book called Servant Leadership. And in it, what he is promoting is that if you want to have a good, profitable business long term, the leaders must see themselves as servants to the employees. Now, you might be very familiar with that concept because it has basically taken over the corporate world. To one extent or another, I'm not saying they all do it perfectly, but it essentially has taken over the corporate world, especially in America. Servant leadership is cliche now. Everybody's heard it. Everybody talks about it. Servant leadership, really. But this is what he came to promote. And what he argues in the book, a number of things. One of the things he argues is that there's a difference between a tyrant and a true leader. And he boils it down to really a very simple test of how you know if you are operating as a tyrant or as a true leader. A tyrant diminishes those under him, takes from them for his own benefit. A true leader enriches those under him, takes from himself to make them better. That's the difference. This is kind of what Paul is saying. Greenleaf, not coincidentally, was a Christian. He was actually a Quaker. And you read his writings and you see that he is pulling, even though he doesn't really reference the Bible, but he is obviously pulling from a Christian value system, that servanthood is great. I would if you want an example of this. So one of the most compelling descriptions of Jesus is in Isaiah. Isaiah 53. My father-in-law mentioned it this morning. You know how he's described in Isaiah 53? The suffering servant. So that's how Paul is envisioning leadership. What is a master in Paul's day in the church of Ephesus? What is a master's role? His role is to serve his slaves, to make their work more productive, more profitable, better for them, not for himself. You might think, well, why don't he just free them? Well, where are they going to go? And what are they going to do? That's easy to say. What if your boss freed you? We have a word for that. Trump made it famous. You're fired. None of you want to be free. I realize that we're broadly, we're kind of mixing two different things, but not entirely. What is employment today if it's not the slavery of old constrained by the values of Christianity? Saying there are limits. Yes, while you're at work, you do as you're told. That's slavery. What Paul was telling masters here is, he is essentially creating in Ephesus this microcosm very similar to what you now take for granted today. Saying to masters, you cannot use threats and force to get them to work. So then how do you do it? Oh. Well, now you're going to have to provide incentives and benefits. There was a guy named Mike Ullman. He was at one time CEO of JCPenney. And he wrote this. He says, to be successful in business, you have to motivate people and get them to work together in teams. The more you care about their welfare, your employees' welfare, the better they will do and the better the company will do. That's how this is what Paul is talking about. He is not saying, let's just flatten it and no one's ever going to do anyone else's bidding. No one's ever going to work for anyone else. The world doesn't work that way. It still doesn't work that way. But he's saying, these relationships, the relationship of a master and a slave, the relationship of a boss and an employee, how can it not be tyrannical? It's not tyrannical when they're each striving for the benefit of the other. And it's the same in marriage, and it's the same with parents. This is all the same. This is why it's summarized in one sentence: submit yourselves one to another. What should you as a Christian be trying to do in every relationship you have? Whether it's voluntary or involuntary. What should you be trying to do? You should be pursuing the benefit of the other. In social terms, and there's a lot more to Christianity than just a social issue. I don't want to come across like this is all just social gospel. But right now we're dealing with social issues. As it pertains to social relationships, the essence of Christianity is seeking the best of others for others. Are you doing that? Is that what you think about as an employee? What's best for my employer? Is that what you think about as an employer? What is best for my employees? Is that what you think about, Paul is saying to the Ephesians, as a master? Do you have slaves because it benefits you? No. He says you can invert that relationship. Masters in the Roman Empire, he's saying, can take that relationship that's fraught with tyranny and abuses and is dirty and horrible and hideous, and you can invert that. And you can become a reflection of Jesus Christ, who became the servant of servants. That's what he told Philemon. Are you doing that? I know you and I like to think we would be the abolitionists. Well, now here is your chance. I wouldn't have done those things if I'd been in Germany. Now here's your chance. I wouldn't have ever had slaves if I would have been in antebellum South. Great. Here is your chance. Take your relationships that you have right now and apply this principle. Become the servant of servants. When we do this, we really do begin to live out the Spirit of Christ in our lives. We begin to reflect it, and people begin to see. And Christianity becomes real, not just theory. So that's what we all need to do. That's what I'm encouraging and challenging each of you to do this week. What relationships do you have? Are you an employer? Well, then you have a relationship where you can apply this principle. Are you an employee? You can apply this principle. Are you a father, a mother, a child, a husband, a wife, a citizen, a government official? There isn't a single relationship where this does not apply. And what is it that he is essentially telling them? And this is the other thing I said we would talk about today, and I'm just going to very briefly touch it, but it was the title of the message. To both masters and slaves, he tells them the same thing. All of this you do as unto the Lord. What Paul did, and it really is brilliant, but what Paul did is in every one of the relationships he dealt with, which kind of categorize all of the relationships that exist, marriage, children, work, right? That's the three big categories of life: marriage, children, work. In all of those, he does the same thing over and over again. Everything he is asking you to do, he's saying, but you don't do it for them. You're seeking their benefit, but not for them, because that's real hard. Because when you're doing it for them, if you're doing it for your husband and he's a jerk, well, that gets old real quick. And if you're doing it for your boss and he's a petty dictator and a tyrant, it's hard to stay focused. And if you're doing it for your employees and they're lazy bums, it's hard to stay focused, right? He says that's the problem. You're doing it in eye service as men pleasers. You're doing it for them. You can't do it for them. And you can do it for yourself. That's the modern psychobabble. Don't do it for others, do it for you. Right? Every diet plan in the world says you have to do it for yourself. Neither of those work. Because those aren't transcendent, eternal values that you can shoot towards. Faith doesn't come into play there. Because it's going to take a great deal of faith for a slave in Ephesus to serve a master who still isn't committed to Christ in the way that Paul is prescribing. So Paul says, in all of these things, you have to do it as unto Christ. Now this is amazing, and we're going to deal with this more later. But essentially what he's saying is, what you do for what Lord, he accepts that. You are actually bypassing all of these things, and you're going right to the source. You say, but my boss is a tyrant. He'll never appreciate it, and he's never going to change. He probably won't. Don't you worry about that, because you're not working for him. You're doing it for Christ, and Christ is the slave of slaves. When you were odious and hateful, he loved you. When you were proud and arrogant, he humbled himself for you and served you, and still does to this day, and looks forward to the day, he says, when he'll serve you again in the kingdom. So serve him. Do it for him. Let's close with prayer. Father in heaven, we are thankful for your word. We are thankful for the conviction that it brings on our heart, even though we don't like it. Father, I ask that you give us the faith and the courage to find one small point in our life and implement it and see the blessing that you will bestow on us when we are obedient and faithful and committed to what you have done, have led us by example to do. Father, we thank you that you have given your Son, who has given us the best example, the ideal example of all of these things, and that now we would commit ourselves to following it, to reflecting it, to projecting that example into the world. And in the name of Jesus, I ask these things.